Okay, so we're going to walk through setting up the leg control system in a second. I noticed there was something I did wrong first, which was that I had constrained my hip control to my hip joint or my base joint uh, without freezing my transformations on it. It has its scale values to it. So does this one and so does this one. So I might just reconstrain these guys. So that was a bad move on my part. So before I constrain my controls, I want to make sure the transformations are frozen. So we're going to right click over here, say all. One thing you might have seen me just do a second ago is uncollapse everything at once. And you can do that by holding shift and left clicking on the plus or minus icon in the outliner. And then instead of having to go, open one, and just keep clicking through, you can just hold shift and click and it'll unlist, or I guess list out everything and uncollapse it. So I'm just going to make sure each of these controls are frozen. This one's not frozen either, so we're going to freeze. Okay, and the main reason we mentioned this earlier is we want to go ahead and freeze our transforms, because let's say I move this up here. Let's say this is going to be the position of our rig. I scale it up because I want, or position of our hips and our head, and I want to scale it up this side. And let's say I want the control to be slightly tilted forward, right? So that looks good, but then we have all these transform values, so translate, rotate, scale. And then when I go ahead and start animating my character and posing them and moving them around through space, if I wanted to go back to that starting point, this is a hard task, because I'd be like, have to remember what were all those values before I moved to this. That gets hard to remember. So it's a lot easier when our controls are zeroed out, right? So let's say this is where we want our control system to be. I move this over here, like I'm rotating and animating my character and going about this. Then when I need my character's rig to go back to its default position, I can just go in here and set the translate rotate values to 0 and the scale value to 1, and my character's back to their default position. So if we don't have these at 0 and 1, we can't really save that position. Okay, so now that those are cleaned up, I want to go ahead and reattach them to, reconstrain them back to their joints. So I'm going to take this hip control, and I'm going to take this hip joint. I'm going to go to my rigging tab, constraint, and we're going to do a parent constraint and make sure maintain offset is turned on, apply. Okay, now I have that constraint underneath the head joint. Yes, underneath the root joint, sorry. I got confused. And then the head control to the head joint. We're just going to do constraint, parent constraint. All right, and these are all parented. The root is the master of the hip, and the hip is the master or parent of the head, and the head is the child. Okay, so now let's go ahead and move on to the next step. So we talked about this earlier, but the difference between FK and IK is that with FK system, each of these joints has their own control to them, right? So if I rotate this, if I want to move the foot to place it over here or put it into a specific position, I have to rotate the thigh, then I have to rotate the knee, and then I have to rotate the ankle to get it to the pose or position I want it to be. IK is where we create what's called a solver, and then that solver is going to actually just take our position of our foot and then automatically rotate the knee and ankle to make that position of the foot make sense. So it's essentially going to take a lot of the work out of your hands, in a good way and sometimes in a bad way, of placing or having to hand animate 3 joints instead of just animating 1 joint. So what we're going to do is we want to create an automated system for the thighs and the knees, so that when I move the foot, the knees and the thighs are going to move too. So when you're doing this with an IK solver, you essentially just want to make sure that you're establishing it between the first joint and the bottom joint. First joint that you click is going to be the first joint that's going to be automatically controlled. And then the last joint you choose is the one that you're going to directly control with a controller. So here, let me go ahead and show you guys what that looks like. I'm going to go to the rigging tab. You can find this either underneath the skeleton at the create IK handle, or you can find this right here. I'll go ahead and click that. So I'm going to start at the base of my joint chain. So I'm going to do it from the thighs, and I'm going to come down to the ankle. So when choosing this, you have to think about which part you actually want to control as the user or the animator. In this case, I don't want to go all the way to like the toe or the ball of the foot because I really want to be able to control the placement of the ankle because I want to move the leg but then also rotate the foot myself. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go here to here. This rig is already set up to be this model, and how we set this joint chain up for the skeleton is already set up to be as easy to use as possible. When you're using this IK solver, the orientation and the bend of these joints in relation to each other is going to change the direction that the solver is going to want to bend this joint chain in. So we bent this leg a little bit forward in a single direction, which makes it really easy for, and we can go ahead and go, let's turn on this X-ray. We can see that a little bit better. So we can see that joint chain right there. So that's going to make it really easy for us to control. It makes it easy for the IK solver to automatically figure out which direction the middle joints are going to bend in. In this case, we only have one middle joint. And so after I've done that, you can see that when I lift up this IK solver handle, you'll see that it's going to automatically rotate the thigh and the knees to make sure that my ankle joint is wherever I put this locator at, right? So if it's over here, it's going to automatically figure out how it needs to rotate this joint and this joint so I can get that ankle. Okay? This is really handy. It just takes a lot of that work out of you and out of your hands, so you don't have to, if I wanted to do something like, say I wanted to put something like that right there, let's do it on the other side, right? I'd have to rotate, like I'm trying to think of where my foot needs to plant. Let's say I need to put the foot, actually let's do it this way. Let me go ahead and set up something really quickly. Okay, so I'm going to put my feet plant them onto here, as if like the character is like doing some kind of Chuck Norris thing. And so what we're going to do is with the IK solver, right, I just really have to drag this IK solver over there. And there we go. It's already in place. If I were to do it with an FK system, and I haven't set up any controls for it, normally I would do those controls. I'd have to rotate the thigh, then rotate the thigh again. Let's get the ankle, but it's kind of, that thigh needs to be put even further forward so I can do that. And it's just this really kind of tedious back and forth. And so FK does have its place, right? It's not like, we're going to use FK for everything, but I just wanted to demonstrate to you guys how IK can take a lot of the tedious work out of certain movements for you. Let's go ahead and get rid of those. Okay, so now that I have my IK system set up on this leg, one other thing I want to talk about is this orientation or this direction of this IK bend, right? And so this arrow right here that you'll see is part of the solver's display, and this white arrow is pointing in the direction that the solver wants to bend this joint chain. And this is what's using what's called a rotate plane solver, which is what we're going to be using for this one. It essentially means that we can set a target or some kind of, I guess, destination, or target's probably the best word, for the direction of that bending to take into account and what it should be bending toward. You'll see if I come in here to the attribute editor under IK solver attributes, or using a rotate plane solver, if you've used your tool and it does not have this display, you can just go ahead into the IK handle setup and recreate your IK handle. Just make sure it's a rotate plane solver. If we come over here, we have what's called the pole vector, and that's the direction that this rotate plane is facing, and so that whenever it bends, it's going to be bending towards that target. And if I came in here and I grabbed this value right here, and I can actually, probably easier to change this in the channel box, I'm going to hold Control middle mouse click with that selected, and you can see I can change that target or that direction that it's going to want to bend towards. So now you'll see when I move this up, that knee is going to want to bend in that direction because I moved it to a destination. Like I said, this is automatically set up when we've created our IK handle, and it's going to set it up in a way that the rotate plane solver, or the rotate plane makes sense, or the pole vector makes sense, without actually deforming your geometry or rotating your bones. So it really is, you can do whatever you want in terms of when you set up your own, of making it bend in a particular direction, but you really want to, it's easiest to go ahead and take into account when you create this joint chain, which direction you want that rotate plane solver to point by default. And it makes it a lot easier if we just go ahead and bend the knees a little bit forward, but then we otherwise keep the joint chain straight. And if you go back and look at how we created this joint chain, you saw that I created the joint chain as straight as I could in this axis. And then it was just in one axis or one direction that we put that bend. And then we rotated it. If it's bent or crooked in multiple axes, this gets a little complicated. Okay, so we have this rotate, or this IK handle on here. And there's two more pieces we're going to put here. First, I want you to notice that when I lift this up, notice how the ankle's trying to keep kind of stiff with the lower leg, right? So it's kind of trying to keep that same angle between them, which is fine, but it kind of gets a little tough because I'm going to want to be able to rotate that foot so that it kind of I have a little bit more control over the direction of it. Because if I'm going to be like making the character walk, right, and I'm lifting up my foot, this is actually doing a pretty good job, but there's going to be points where I want to rotate the ankle but keep the position of the leg intact. So I'm going to want a little bit more control over the feet. And then the other thing is I want some control over the knees because I don't always want the knees to point forward and back. Sometimes I want the knees to rotate out like this or bend in a particular way. What we're going to do is we're going to create a knee control to determine which direction it's going to point. First, let's go ahead and handle this foot. So I'm going to go ahead and take the values for this, zero that out. Let's zero this out in the Y direction. Actually, let's just Control Z that back. All right, because this is the default pole vector or IK handles position. And so what we're going to do is, just like the joints, I don't really want to manually rotate the joints, right? Because that's not very clean. We're going to want to rotate and animate and translate controls, right? Because the controls are all cleaned up. They don't have to rely on particular values that are saved in them for the joint skeleton to work. And same thing with the IK handle. They need their own kind of values that we can't really mess with or touch, or it's going to screw everything up. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some foot controls. So I'm just going to generate some new little controls. We'll bring this over here. Go ahead and scale this into sort of like a foot position, or foot shape. Let's go ahead and scale this in y-axis there. And we're not going super deep with animating or creating a rig for animators. But generally speaking, you want your controls to be easy to grab and easy to select. Right? All of these are kind of outside of the mesh. They're easy to grab, and they're easy to differentiate from each other. And that's kind of why I put this head control up here instead of right down there, because it would be overlapping the waist. I'm just going to put that right there. I'm going to actually go ahead and duplicate this so I can have a ball, the foot, and a ankle control. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and duplicate this. And I'm going to isolate this, and I duplicate it by just going to Edit, Duplicate. And we're going to isolate this. I'm just going to click on this little button right here. I'm just going to isolate selected. I'll grab this, and I'm just going to grab these back vertices or control vertices for this curve by going to Control Vertice mode, Control Vertex mode, just flattening them down and just bringing them up. I'm just really just creating a custom little extra front foot part. We'll grab the same thing where we grab this, and I want to isolate it. We'll grab these front, scale them down. Okay. And we'll go out of there. Now we have like a front part and the back part. And so what I'm going to do is for this back part, it's going to be lifting up the ankle and rotating the ankle. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. Oh no, sorry, not duplicate. I'm going to edit its pivot point. So I'm going to press D, edit pivot point. And then I'm going to turn on snap to vertice. And we're going to go ahead and snap this pivot point to the center of that ankle. If you're having a hard time snapping, remember you can always just hide, turn off the visibility of this, the geometry display layer, so that we can easily snap this into the middle of the joint instead of onto a particular group. And we're going to do the same thing with this one. I'm just going to select this control, press D to edit the pivot point. And with the point snapping turned on still, I'll just press D, snap that to the middle of that. Press D when we're done. Okay. And I'm going to turn off snapping to point. I'm going to grab both these controls now that they're in position, and I'm going to freeze their transformation. We're going to right click over here in the channel box and say freeze all. And we're going to turn the geometry back on. So this one's going to rotate right there, and this one's going to rotate right there. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is for this ankle control, let's go ahead and call these, name these. So this one's going to be called, let's see, ankle underscore R underscore CTRL for control. And this one's going to be called toe underscore R underscore CTRL. Okay. I'm going to just go ahead and parent directly this IK handle underneath this control. When I move the ankle up and down, I want this IK handle to move up and down. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this control, or this IK handle. I'm going to shift select this control, and I'm just going to go to edit parent, put the IK handle underneath that ankle control. Now when I move that ankle control, it'll move that IK. Very easy. Okay, and I'm going to parent this toe control underneath the ankle, because when I move this ankle, I want the toe to also move with it too. I'm going to take this toe, then shift select or control select the ankle, and go edit parent. Now that toe is now underneath the ankle. Now when I move the ankle, they're all moving together. Great, so we have a control now. So now I want to constrain this ankle to the rotation or direction of this control right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select this ankle control, shift select this ankle. We're going to come over to ankle joint, and we're going to go to constraint parent. Oh, but that's not going to work. So let's go ahead and do it differently. Maintain offset. Okay, so we're going to do constraint orient constraint. So what it's going to do, and again, I want to make sure it maintains offset. I think I might have a little bit of a rotate value somewhere in here. Yeah, it should be fine. Okay, so maybe I just need to make sure, I go to constraint, orient constraint, make sure maintain offsets, turn apply. That should. Now I can lift up that ankle and it's working, the ankle control is moving the IK handle, which is great, but the orientation or rotation of the foot is based on the angle of this ankle control or foot control. But there's a problem in that when I move this up and I want to rotate it, it's also rotating the IK handle. That's going to be a problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to unparent this IK handle. So I'm going to go to edit, unparent. Instead, we're going to go ahead and parent or do a point constraint. So I just kind of breezed over this, but let's go ahead and take a step back for a second. So for all of our other controls, we've been doing parent constraint. And what that does is that joint will copy, it will behave a lot like a parent-child relationship. And so it's going to copy the rotation of the control. So the joint's going to act like a child to the control without being directly parented. So it's going to copy the rotation and the position. So we have these other constraints in here, and I just did one that's called orient. And what it's going to do is, what orient constraint does is it makes the joint or the child copy the rotation of the control, but without copying the location as well. So orient just does the rotation part of a parent constraint. We have a parent constraint, which is going to do both rotation and position. And then we have point and orient, which is just one and not both. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this control, select this IK handle. We're going to do constraint. We're going to do point constraint. This is going to be your translation copying. And I'll just make sure my maintain offset is turned on. Apply. So now when I move this, the IK handle is going to copy the position of this control, but when I rotate it, it's not copying the rotation of this control because we used point constraint instead of a parent constraint. And then when I move this around, the ankle is copying the rotation value of this control because I use an orient constraint instead of a parent constraint. We have a lot of different constraints, and this might sound a little confusing, but just keep that in mind that your parent constraint is going to copy both rotation and position, and then the point constraint is going to copy just the position and the orient constraint is going to copy just the rotation. Slightly more complicated than that, but that is the basics of those two controls, or those two constraints. And so now I can move and rotate and position my ankle. And my thighs and my knees are going to follow along. Great. That's super easy. Or maybe not easy for you guys. I don't know. Maybe it's not easy for you guys. Maybe it is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and parent this toe object to, or joint to the toe control. When I say parent, I mean parent constraint. So I want to select the toe control. Shift select the toe joint. We're going to do constraint, parent constraint. Now when I rotate this, it taps the foot. So there we go. And we can get, or if I need to move the foot here and then rotate it like that, and I want it to be with the toe on the ground, I could do something like this. This isn't actually how I probably would set it up, but we're not going to get into anything too complicated right now. But this is just a basic kind of foot control again. And then once that's done, we are going to now fix the knee. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to create a new control. I'm going to scale this down. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using what's called a pole vector target. I showed you guys an aim constraint earlier, which is where if I have an object and have a target, if I do an aim constraint, I can select the thing I want to constrain, and then the target it's going for, go to constraint, aim constraint. Oop, I did it backwards. Constraint, aim constraint. And let's go ahead and do that with maintain offset on. Constraint, maintain offset. What happens is the aim constraint is always going to point at the target, right? So the object that's being constrained is always going to orient to wherever the object is. We're not using that for this right here, but this is what the pole vector target's kind of doing. But it's specifically affecting that pole vector value that's changing the direction my knee's pointing in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create that, create that curve. And this is pretty important. We're going to snap that control to the knee joint. I'm going to hold V or turn on snapping to point. I want to snap it directly onto that knee. And I can turn off that G so I can make sure it's actually snapping to the joint. Okay. So it's really important that it's going to copy this joint's center in that position. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and rotate it in the x-axis, 90 degrees, sorry. And we're going to just move it forward in the local object direction. So I'm going to hold W, left click and hold, and go to object, and that's just going to switch my orientation mode. Or you can come over to tool settings and change your axis orientation to object. And we're just going to drag this off. And it might not work, but let's try it first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select my IK handle, then I'm going to select my control. Might have got that backwards, but we'll find out. And we're going to go ahead and apply. Yep, so I have to select the IK handle second. We're going to apply our pole vector constraint. And so when you do this, you want to make sure that the leg doesn't move. If the leg moves, then there's something set up a little wrong. And you can live with it for this assignment, but generally speaking, whenever you're setting up all your controls, you don't want any parts of the geometry to move, because that means that something isn't quite right, and your character, what you thought was going to be their neutral pose, is not going to work because it's going to getting some slight transform values, and that's going to be off model. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. And pole vector constraint. You'll see that arrow, or that line that we previously saw when we were dragging that pole vector value on the IK handle, is now pointing at this control, right? And now whenever I move this, you'll see that that pole vector is causing the knee to point in a particular direction. So this knee control is letting me control the orientation or direction of the thigh and knee. We're going to go ahead and, but before I do that, I made another mistake, right? So I'm going to control Z this back. I'm going to come back here and I'm going to go ahead and make sure I freeze my transform. Let's go ahead and before I do that though, I'm going to do it bad again just to show you guys. Constraint, pole vector constraint. So that's fine, but I have my transform values. So remember, if you ever get to a point where you forget and you're further along, you can't control Z back, and you're like, oh no, I constrained this, and my control doesn't have zeroed out transformations. You can just come in here underneath the child object, or the object that is being constrained. You can come over here and you can just delete that constraint here. I'm going to select that pole vector constraint, delete it. So now they're no longer constrained. So I'll come in here, right click, freeze my transformations on my control. It's all zeroed out. It's good to go. Come back in here, constrain, pole vector constraint. There we go. Now I can go ahead and lift my foot control, and I can control the orientation or direction of the knee and the thighs by dragging this knee control. And sometimes you might want to go ahead and, let's go ahead and move this forward. Something that will break a little bit is if the knee control is in front of or behind this IK handle. So when you drag out that control for the first time, just make sure you give yourself enough space. Okay. So once that's done, what you can do is you can go ahead and I like to hide the IK handle. Because remember, the animator is only going to be messing around with the joints. They're not going to be messing around with they're only going to be messing around with the controls. You don't want them to touch the joints or any other system you've built, including the IK handles. Before I do that, I'm going to Control Z and bring that IK back. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and I'm going to delete this side. I'm going to grab this, so I deleted that joint chain over there because I want to re-mirror this across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to skeleton, mirror joint. Open this up. We're going to search for _L_, and we're going to replace it with _R_. So that we're renaming the _L part to right for right side. We're going to mirror across the YZ plane, which is going to be essentially the x-axis. Apply. Okay. By doing that, we went ahead and it automatically created that IK handle on the other side for us too. Not that it would have been easy. I mean, not that it would have been hard for us to have to just remake the IK handle, but this is just as simple. Okay. And I probably should have named these. So I might call this like left. This will be called leg _R _IK handle. And I'll just copy, and I should have renamed that before I did mirroring. This one's called the left side of the character. Okay. And this is going to be the knee control, so we'll call this knee _R, or sorry, _L _CTRL. And I'm realizing I named these ones wrong, so they should be left side. Okay, all left side. All right, so now what I need to do is I need to go ahead and mirror my controls from one side to the other. Okay, so to mirror this, what we're going to do is we are going to take our controls for the leg, because those are the only ones that we really need to transfer to the other side. I'm going to select the knee and the ankle. Because I'm selecting the ankle, it's also selecting the toe, which is its child. And I'm going to go to Edit. Well, actually, first what we're going to do is we're going to edit, duplicate. It's going to create duplicates for us. We're going to go ahead and do edit group. Because what we're going to do is we're going to scale this across the x-axis or the origin point to the opposite side. Because our character is symmetrical from the left side to the right side across the x-axis, we're just going to use inverse scaling to swap it from one side to the other. We'll just show you what. I'm going to go to edit with this duplicated option select, or duplicated pieces selected. I'm going to go to group. Okay. You'll see with that group, its origin is in the center of our scene, which also happens to be the center of our character. And what I can do is I can come here to the scale Z, and you'll see when I scale the, X. So you'll see when I scale it in the X, once I scale it to the other, if I scale it less than 1, less than 0, it's going to scale across the x-axis and mirror on the other side. So I can just come in here and I can do scale x -1 for that group. You'll see now it's on the other side. Great, that's in position. And now what I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to unparent these guys. I'll take those, both of those, go edit, unparent. You can do also ungroup, it doesn't really matter. Let's do unparent. That didn't work. Okay. But the problem is now we have these rotate and scale values on these controls. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here on both of these controls and right click and say freeze all. I'm going to check all three of these controls. So we have our knee, our foot, our toe. They're all cleared out and frozen. And it's a good idea to just kind of test them out, look at their transformations and make sure their like orientations are in the right spot. And it's looking compared to the other ones. Okay. So now that those are in the right spot, I'm going to rename them. So we're going to come over here to the ankle controls from the previous one. Oh, I think I accidentally duplicated. I have an accidental duplicate. I can also delete that group I used to do the flipping or the mirroring. And I just delete that. I don't need that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these ankle underscore L underscore CTRL, and we're just going to go to modify, search and replace names. So we're going to rename them. We're going to search for the underscore L underscore, replace them with the underscore R underscore. And we'll do it with hierarchy, which is going to grab both of these guys and anything that's a child of them. Click apply. And we'll just come in here and we'll delete that too. So that's looking good. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and set up my constraints for this side as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take this IK handle, and we are going to do a point constraint onto the this control right here, right? Because when we move this, translate this, we want the IK handle to move as well. We're going to go ahead and select the foot control. We're going to select the IK handle. We're going to go to constraint, point constraint. And every time you do this, you want to just test it out. That looks good. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and I want the rotation of this control to be rotating the ankle. So I'm going to go ahead and select this control, then shift select that ankle. I'm going to go to constraint, orient constraint. That's going to make it so the ankle copies the orientation or rotation of my foot control. Great. Okay. The last thing we need to do for those is we need to go ahead and select our knee control and then select our IK handle, and we're going to use a pole vector constraint to make it so the knee always points at the constraint. Pole vector constraint. Now, one around, that looks good. Over here, move that around, that looks good. Everything's looking like it's working correctly. So once I'm at that stage, I'm going to go ahead and hide my IK handles. Select them, go into display, hide, selection, or Control H on your keyboard. Okay. We need to make sure our parenting is right. So the nice thing is once we set up these controls, it makes it so we can do like a crouching action and we can move the upper torso around and the feet stay planted, which is going to be great. But we also want to be able to move our entire rig together. So what we're going to do is we're going to parent both of these foot controls. I'm going to shift select both of them, shift select the master control or root control. We're just going to press P. And that's just going to parent them both underneath there. We'll do the same thing for the knees. We'll shift select both of them, shift select the root control, and then press P or edit parents. Make them children of the master control. So all that's left, as you guys can tell, is I need to go ahead and bind these pieces of geometry on this side to these new joints I created. I had to mirror across. I'm just going to go ahead and select each joint and the geometry it's going to control. So in this case, I think it's this knee piece and thigh piece to this joint. I'm going to go ahead and go to skin, open up the settings for bind skin, make sure it's set to selected joints. So it's only binding to this joint and not all of these joints if I did hierarchy. Apply. Select the knee joint, select the lower leg and the ankle, apply. Select the foot joint, select these two, apply, select the toe joint, select the toe geometry, and click apply. Okay. Now I should be able to test that out. Looks good. That's looking right. And when I rotate that, not rotating anything, so I missed a constraint. This is why you want to test everything out. I want to select this control, shift select this joint, constraint, do up. And so now when I rotate that, that's looking good. All right, so when we're at this stage, we want to go ahead and do a quick test and see if everything's working. All the pieces of geometry are constrained to a joint. Nothing's being left behind. Nothing's constrained to what it's not supposed to. I want to make sure all my controls have zeroed out transformations. Oh, you see, there's an area where I don't have a zeroed out constraint, zeroed out values in the transform values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to those IK handles. Those pull vector constraints. I must have control Z too many times because we already did this. So we're going to select both of these, right click, freeze all, and we'll just go ahead and reconstrain them to their IK handles. So we'll just select, I'm going to select this knee control, knee KI handle, constraint, pull vector constraints, knee right to leg right IK handle, constraint, pull vector. Now those are all zeroed out. I probably want to go ahead and make sure that the IK handles are also underneath. Might cause some double transformation. Nope, that looks fine. All right. So what we could do here is now we have our in my root control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all these guys. I'm going to go ahead and unparent them. So we're going to go edit, unparent. Before I do that, though, I'm going to go ahead and make sure I'm only selecting the top piece, so I don't accidentally unparent any of these sub-children from their parents. I just want to get them out of the root control so I can freeze out the root. We're going to edit, parent, take this root control, freeze all, and I might, that's a little frustrating because now these guys picked up some extra values. So this is, clearly where a mistake I made coming back to haunt me later on. So I should have been more thorough in making sure that all of my controls were zeroed out. So what I might do is, you can see if I try to freeze this out. I guess in this case it didn't cause any problems. You usually don't want to freeze your controls when they're constrained. It can cause some bad stuff, but it seems like that case, probably bad practice, but in this case, for the sake of done, I think. All right, so I'll go root control. We'll go through these, just double check. And yep. Okay. And we're just going to test this out by moving around. Good. Rotate the character. That looks good. And I know it's not going to work when I scale the character. So we're going to have to do one final cleanup step. This is something that always trips people up, is the scaling issue. So what's happening here is we're getting a double transformation issue going on in a lot of different pieces because we have these controls. When I scale this up and down, we have these controls that are moving the joints, but we also have these subsystems that are controlling the joints. And then whenever we put everything together into a group, if I scale it down, I'm scaling down the joints, which are moving the geometry, and then I'm also scaling the geometry, which is also moving the joints. It gets a little complicated, but generally speaking, we're getting what's called double transformation values, which is where multiple things are just not set up to be scaled down the same. And this actually isn't specifically double transformation values, but whenever you see that, that's usually what's happening. But let's go ahead and try it really quickly. Okay, so to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to regroup all of our pieces together in a way that when we scale something, it's scaling both the geometry, the joints, and the controls at the same time. Because right now, because they're separate, they're not really following along at the same rate, right? So the geometry is not really scaling, the joints aren't really scaling, right? So it gets a little confused. So I'm going to go ahead and treat my root controller as the master group for everything in my character. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my base joints, I'm going to middle mouse click and drag them under here. I'm going to take my geometry, so we'll call this one _geo for my geometry group, and that has all my geometry in it. I'll middle mouse click that as well underneath the root control. That's just another way you can parent in the outliner. Instead I can select this, control select the root control, and go to edit parent, so that is parented underneath. Okay, and then because all these control pieces are a little, this gets a little hard to read against the joint, the skeleton, and the geometry, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select all the control pieces, and I'm going to go ahead and group them by pressing Control G. I want to call this one controls underscore grp for group. Okay. And maybe I'll call this one underscore geo underscore. That's just good to be as consistent as I can be. All right, so now they're all underneath here. And you'll notice now at least the body's scaling, and it's not like the pieces are kind of like, it's not like he's like crouching into oblivion and just like breaking everything. But the body is scaling at a different rate. And this is what I was saying earlier with the double transform values, is that I'm scaling both the controls, which is scaling the joints, which is moving the geometry, and so I'm scaling the joints and the geometry at the same time. So I'm essentially scaling them twice because I'm scaling them and their control structure at the same time. So that's what's causing them. If I double this up twice as large, it's actually getting, the geometry is actually getting 4 times as large because it's getting scaled up twice. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to the geo group. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to select the first one, and underneath the attribute editor on the first tab, underneath our transform values, we have this value right here that's called inherits transform. And so when we turn this off, it's not going to scale based on the scaling of this piece right here. It's just they're only going to scale based on the parts that they're attached to, or the joints that they're attached to. I'm going to select this. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck inherits transforms. And I want to do this on each piece of geo. So to make this go faster, I could run a really quick mel script if I wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and press right on my keyboard, the right arrow. And that's just going to step to the next asset or object in the scene that is underneath the current parent. So going to the body. So I click that, press right on the keyboard, and I'm just unchecking inherits transform from each of the pieces of And just to give you guys an idea of that arrow thing, it's a nice little handy shortcut. I can press up and it'll go up to the parent. Press up again, it goes up to the parent. Press down, it goes to a child. And you can press left and right to switch to a different child. The left and right switching between the current children. And if I press down, it's going to go to that current object's children, and then left and right. And then if you press down, it goes to the shape node, which you can't see, but it's essentially a little child underneath each of these. If you went in here and went display shapes, you'll see that each of these has a little node. But you guys don't have to right now. Okay, so now when I scale this control, it's going to scale everything together, and nothing is breaking, which is great. Okay. All right, so now all that's left to do is I'm just going to go ahead and go through and make sure everything has a name. So the constraints, personally, just especially for this situation, I'm not super interested in you guys naming that stuff. It's okay. But all of my joints should have a name to them. All of my controls and all of my geometry should have names to them. And they should all be relative to their what part of the body they're associated with and what side, if they have a particular side. Okay? So in this case, all of mine are set up nicely. I want all of my controls to have zeroed out transformation values so that when the animator is animating, if they make a move on any of the controls, we're not getting into a situation where they have to remember what the translate values are for the default position. So we want to make sure those are all frozen out. Okay. Next step I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hide the joints. So I'll just select the joints. You can put them into a new display layer if you want. So you can create layer selected, joints, and save. And we can set this to reference mode if you don't want them to click it, or you just hide it, or we could just hidden it in the outline by doing the display. The geometry, we're going to go ahead and set to reference mode or use any other method of preventing the user from clicking on it. Next, what we can do is we can come into, there's a couple things we can do. We can change the control colors of our controls pretty easily. What we do is we go ahead and select the control. Because right now they're kind of this dark blue, and it really depends on what you're doing, but they might be kind of hard to see against the background. So I'm going to select this base control. We're going to come over to the shape node right here. Come over to object display, drawing overrides. We're going to go ahead and click on enable override, and we're just going to choose a different color. So let's say I just choose yellow. Now you can see that control is yellow. And then what a lot of people like to do is they like to color code the different sides. So for instance, like maybe the left side is going to be this blue color. It's pretty dark blue, so let's see if there's like a cyan. Chlorides, cyan. Same thing with the knee control. And you can see this, especially, this is a really simple rig, but if you had a more complicated rig, that can be really tedious doing this. So this is where like a little bit of, looking into a little bit of a Mel script or something like that just to speed up this process and really any process for the rig. And we're just going to set these all to, and we'll just go ahead and select both guys yellow. Okay. And the last thing we can do if we want to kind of keep making this friendly for the animator is limiting our controls. It really depends on what you're doing and how your animator likes to work. But you have two ways that you can limit your controls. First is you can lock and hide attributes so that the animator doesn't accidentally move it in an unintentional way. So for instance, like this waist control, or this head control, I don't really intend for them to separate like this. So what I could do is I can select these translate values, and I can right click and say lock and hide selected. What that's going to do is it's going to make it so I can't actually translate it, I can only rotate. And same thing, I can do the same thing with scale. This is a preference that's really dependent on who you work with and how you want to animate. Some people like to be like clear instructions of what a control is supposed to be able to do. And then some people like to have the flexibility to do what they want with the rig. So it's really up to who you're working with and how they prefer working. Another thing I can do is if I come in here and rotate, you'll see there's a certain point where I probably don't want to rotate this far. Like I don't want to rotate down here or over here. And what we can do is we can come over to the attribute editor. We're going to come to the first tab. And we're going to come down to the limit information. And so here you can set an upwards and an up and bottom bound for any of your translate values. So what you can do is, let's say over here, negative 45. Let's say negative 45 is going to be the max I want to be able to rotate this way. So let's just set that to negative 45. We can go ahead and click on this little arrow to copy that value into the max setting. And we'll go ahead and click on turn on max. What that does is it makes it so, oh, actually this is going to be a little confusing, but let's go ahead and get this to the minimum. So this is going to prevent me from rotating. I was doing it the wrong way. So you can see it sets a minimum value that the rotate Z can no longer go below. And then let's set the other one. Let's turn on max. And we'll set this to positive 45 on the other. Positive 45. So I can only rotate that far. And then I can do the same thing with all of my other translate values. Rotate Y, probably don't want to limit that one, but rotate X, maybe I want to do the same thing. So we'll just go ahead and do negative 45, copy that to the min, and then we'll just copy this to the max. That's a 45. The defaults were already 45, so I probably didn't even need to do that. But now we can see that I can only rotate them that way, right? So that's another way you could limit things. And instead of freezing and locking the transform values, you could also just set these so that the min max is 0. Can't translate it. But it's really up to you. And again, just like the locking and hiding the transform values, that's another thing that some people don't really like. They don't really like having a limitation set as an animator. So it's really up to who you're working with. So that's pretty much it. The main stages of working on a character rig, and this is by no means in depth and is not going to really help you make like a fully functional bipedal character. There's a lot of other things we need to keep in mind because we tried to keep this as simple as possible, but this will give you kind of the idea of the working structure or process. So what we do is we imported our geometry from our character. We made sure our geometry was all cleaned up. Let me go ahead and deselect that. We wanted to make sure there was no history. So we have history here, but that's from after we started rigging. So we wanted to make sure there's no poly modeling history. So if I grab this and I grab like face and extrude it, and then I did like the multi-cut tool, enter, right? That object has history to it. Come down here, poly split, tweak, extrude face, right, and even the cube. So what we wanted to do is when we brought it in, if it did have history, we just delete by type history object. It has no inputs tab, right? So that's the first step of cleaning it up. We want to make sure our character, our geometry also had their values all frozen, right? So they're all translate, rotate values are 0, and the scale values are 1. And then we also, of course, want to make sure that they're in the right spot. Generally speaking, you want to have your character centered across the middle of the scene. So my character was already kind of centered on the origin point, but if they're off over here, it makes our lives a little bit harder, and we really just want to not do that. Then once our geometry was all cleaned up and everything was named, and throughout this whole process for naming everything, we built our joint structure. So we started from our base joint, so that's the root joint that's going to be the parent of every other joint. And for our case, most bipedal characters, it's going to be somewhere around the hips. And then we drew out our joint chains going in the different directions down different limbs. So in our case, we only have legs and a top torso. But if we had arms and a neck and a head, those would also be joint chains we would have created as well. And then we just made sure those were parented underneath our root joint, so that when the root joint moves, all of our different body chain pieces are going to follow along. Once our joints were in position, we went ahead and created these controls that the animator is going to eventually use. We positioned them, and most of the time, it really depends. It's not always the case, but most of the time, we want our controls to have their same exact pivot point as the joints. So when you're first starting out and you don't know what you're doing, generally speaking, just make sure your controls have the exact same pivot point location as our joints. So you don't get, when I rotate a control, a joint's not like translating and moving through space. It's only rotating around itself. And then once these were in position, we went ahead and froze their transformations, so they're 0 to 1. And then we went ahead and parented them in a nice, easy way, so that, when I move the waist, the head's going to move. When I move the head, it's going to move separately. When I move this foot ankle, it's going to move the toe as well, right? So a lot of it's just testing and seeing if everything's moving the way you think it's supposed to move. And then when I move this base root control or master control, it's moving all my controls together. Once those controls are all in place, I went ahead and constrained them to each joint. So we just did a parent constraint for most of them, like the hips and the head. And then we did a IK handle for the legs, so that when we only have to move the ankle, and the knees and thighs are going to go ahead and figure it out for us. So the IK handle is just underneath this foot control. And then we created knee controls for that IK handle to point towards. So that's pretty much it. And then when we were done, we just did a cleanup step where we made sure everything had a name. All of our controls are frozen out. All of our geometry was frozen out. We went ahead and we went to, so one thing I probably should have done is when I froze my controls, I should have also deleted history on. But I'm not going to go back and mess with that right now. And then once we kind of grouped this all together so that we can do the scaling, then it's the cleanup step where we are hiding our joints so nobody can select them. We're making the geometry visible but not selectable, so you can see it but you're not going to be able to click on it. And we're limiting our controls values if we want to, so that the animator, doesn't do something that the rig isn't intended to do, and just trying to make their life as easy as possible. And so yeah, that's it. That's pretty much the basics of getting into rigging and understand how building a rig affects a character. And so that's, if you guys are following along with this for an assignment, this is essentially as far as you need to get to for the homework. And that's the end of this. Hope that was helpful.